4,000 years ago, a family in ancient Egypt placed their dead inside a tomb, surrounded them with objects they believed would matter in the next life, and sealed the burial away. Then the tomb disappeared. Not for a few decades, not for a few centuries. For almost 4,000 years, the people buried there remained hidden beneath the landscape of Luxor. And when archaeologists finally opened the tomb, they did not find a single forgotten individual. They found an entire family, men, women, children, 11 burials in all. And among the remains were objects that had survived thousands of years of flooding, decay, and time itself. But the jewelry was only part of the discovery, because this tomb was found in a place archaeologists thought they already understood. And what was hidden beneath it forced researchers to rethink the history of an entire ancient cemetery. The discovery happened in the South Asasif necropolis on the west bank of the Nile, near the famous temple of Hatshepsut at Luxor. For years, archaeologists had been working in this area as part of the South Asasif Conservation Project, directed by Egyptologist Elena Pishikova. The project was already dealing with much later tombs, including the monumental tomb of Karabaskan, which dates to Egypt's 25th Dynasty. But during excavation work in 2023 and 2024, the team began clearing an area beside the tomb, and underneath the accumulated debris was something nobody expected. A much older burial complex. It belonged to Egypt's Middle Kingdom. That meant the tomb was roughly 4,000 years old. And even more importantly, it was the first Middle Kingdom tomb identified in the South Asasif necropolis. That detail sounds technical. It isn't. Because it completely changed what archaeologists thought this landscape had been used for. The South Asasif area was already famous for later burials, but now there was physical evidence that people had been using this part of the Theban necropolis centuries earlier than previously demonstrated. And then the team reached the burials. There were 11 of them. 5 were identified as women, 2 were men, 3 were children. The remains of another individual were also recorded in the excavation. The arrangement suggested something very different from a single royal burial. This looked like a family tomb, and it appears to have been used across several generations during the 12th Dynasty and into the beginning of the 13th Dynasty. That means this wasn't simply a place where one person was buried and forgotten. People came back generation after generation. They opened the burial space, added another member of the family, and closed it again. And that raises a fascinating question. What did these people believe would happen to their family after death? To understand why the objects found inside matter so much, we have to understand the world these people lived in. The tomb dates to Egypt's Middle Kingdom, a period roughly spanning the early 2nd millennium BC. This was a very different Egypt from the one most people picture when they think of pharaohs. The pyramids of Giza were already ancient history. Tutankhamun would not appear for roughly another 700 years. The great temples of New Kingdom Egypt had not yet been built. And the famous Valley of the Kings did not yet exist in the form we know today. Yet the Egyptians of this period already possessed an elaborate understanding of death, burial, and the afterlife. The body mattered, the tomb mattered, and the objects placed beside the dead mattered, because death was not necessarily viewed as the end. It was a transition. The deceased needed protection, they needed food, they needed ritual objects, and depending on their status and resources, they could be buried with jewelry, amulets, mirrors, figurines, and other possessions. That is exactly why this discovery became so valuable. The tomb wasn't simply a collection of human remains, it was a snapshot of how one family prepared its dead. And some of the objects survived in extraordinary condition. The reason is surprising. The tomb itself did not remain perfectly preserved. Ancient flooding damaged it badly. Water destroyed much of the wooden material. It damaged coffins. It destroyed large portions of the linen wrappings used in the burials. So at first glance, you might expect almost everything inside to have disappeared. But some materials survived much better than others. Stone survived, metal survived, faience survived, and precious materials survived especially well. That is where the story becomes much more interesting. Archaeologists recovered necklaces, bracelets, rings, amulets, and other pieces of jewelry. Some were made using materials including amethyst, carnelian, garnet, feldspar, and blue-green faience. These weren't random decorations. Many of the objects carried symbolic meanings connected with protection and the afterlife. One necklace was particularly unusual. It contained dozens of faience beads arranged with stone beads and a hippopotamus head amulet. Another burial contained a striking collection of jewelry that had remained remarkably well preserved despite the damage caused by flooding. And then archaeologists found something that revealed another side of this ancient family's life. Mirrors. 2 copper mirrors were recovered. One had a lotus-shaped handle, the other had a design associated with Hathor. Hathor was one of ancient Egypt's most important goddesses, associated with areas including women, fertility, motherhood, love, music, and the sky. So suddenly, the objects were telling us something. These weren't simply people who had been buried with whatever happened to be available. The burial goods reflected identity, status, beliefs, and perhaps the roles these people held while they were alive. But the most important clue may have been something much less glamorous: the people themselves. The presence of men, women, and children suggested that the tomb was connected to a family, rather than being an isolated elite burial. And that changes the question. Instead of asking, who was the most important person buried here? Archaeologists can ask something much bigger. How did an ordinary or moderately wealthy family actually practice death and remembrance during Egypt's Middle Kingdom? That question is incredibly difficult to answer. Royal tombs are spectacular. They contain inscriptions. They contain elaborate decoration. They were designed to announce the importance of the person inside. But ordinary families leave behind much less evidence. Their houses disappear. Their belongings decay. Their wooden objects rot. Their names may never appear in surviving records, and their graves are often disturbed. That is why a family burial with surviving objects can be so valuable. It gives researchers a chance to move beyond the kings, beyond the pyramids, beyond the famous names, and into the lives of people who existed within Egyptian society, but were not rulers themselves. But then another problem appeared. The tomb had not simply been frozen in time. It had been attacked by nature. Floodwater had passed through the burial area, and that means the preservation was uneven. Some objects survived, others were destroyed. Some coffins remained only as fragments, and much of the organic material disappeared. So archaeologists have to reconstruct the story from pieces. A necklace here, a mirror there, a fragment of a coffin, a human skeleton, a burial position, and the location of each object. It is almost like reconstructing a crime scene after 4,000 years of weather has passed through it. And there is another clue hidden in the layout. The burials were placed side by side, with their coffins generally oriented north to south. The people buried there were not all the same. They belonged to different ages and genders. That pattern is exactly what you would expect if the tomb had been reused by a family over time. Someone died, they were buried. Years passed, another family member died. The tomb was opened again. Another burial was placed inside, then another, and eventually the entrance was closed. The process may have continued for generations. That means the tomb wasn't just a final destination, it was part of the family's memory, a physical place where generations remained connected. And that idea gives the discovery a very different feeling. Imagine being born into that family. Your ancestors are already buried beneath the ground. Their jewelry is still there. Their names and possessions may still exist. And one day, when you die, your family returns to the same place. The tomb becomes a physical link between generations. But there is something even more surprising about where this happened. The South Asasif necropolis was not simply an isolated patch of desert. It sits within the enormous archaeological landscape of ancient Thebes. Across the Nile from modern Luxor, this area became one of the most important burial landscapes in ancient Egypt. Thousands of years of Egyptian history accumulated here. Different dynasties, different rulers, different religious traditions, different burial customs, layer after layer. And now archaeologists had evidence that this particular part of the landscape was already being used during the Middle Kingdom. That means the history of the necropolis is older and more complicated than its later monuments alone suggest. The discovery effectively pushed part of that story backward in time. But the objects inside the tomb raised another question. Why did some survive so well while other parts of the burials were almost completely destroyed? The answer comes down to material. Wood is vulnerable. Linen is vulnerable. Organic material can disappear under the right conditions. But stone and mineral-based materials can survive for thousands of years. That is why jewelry becomes so important. It acts almost like a time capsule. A necklace doesn't just tell us that someone owned jewelry. Its materials can tell us about technology. Its style can tell us about cultural connections. Its amulets can tell us about religious beliefs. And its position in a burial can sometimes tell archaeologists how the object was used. One small object can carry several layers of information at once. And this is where the discovery becomes bigger than a treasure story, because the real value of archaeology isn't the amount of gold or gemstones found inside a tomb. It is the information. Every object has context. Where was it found? Who was buried with it? Was it worn? Was it deliberately placed? Was it part of a ritual? Was it made locally? Was the material imported? Those questions can reveal how ancient people lived, and sometimes they reveal connections between regions that were separated by hundreds of miles. The South Asasif jewelry may help researchers understand those connections more clearly. But there is another mystery. If this tomb was used for generations, why did it disappear? The answer may be partly environmental. The landscape of the Nile Valley has changed repeatedly over thousands of years. Flooding affected ancient cemeteries. Sediment accumulated. Structures collapsed. Later construction covered earlier remains. And eventually, a place that once mattered deeply to a family could become almost invisible. The tomb didn't necessarily need to be intentionally hidden. It only needed to become forgotten. A few centuries pass, then a few more. And eventually the people who built the tomb are gone. The people who remembered them are gone. The people who knew where the entrance was are gone. The landscape changes, and the tomb becomes another piece of buried history. That is exactly what makes archaeological discoveries like this so strange. The people who lived 4,000 years ago never expected us to find them. They built for their beliefs. They buried their family. They closed the tomb. And then history moved on. But the objects remained. And now modern archaeologists are trying to reconstruct a story from those surviving pieces. There is still much we do not know. The identities of every individual buried there are not all established. The exact family relationships require further study. The full meaning of every burial object is not automatically obvious, and the damage caused by flooding means that some information has simply been lost forever. That is an important distinction. Archaeology does not magically bring the past back. It works with what survived, and sometimes what survived is enough to change our understanding. Before this discovery, the South Asasif necropolis was strongly associated with later periods of Egyptian history. Now we know that Middle Kingdom burials existed there too. That creates a much longer timeline. It suggests that the area was part of a broader Theban funerary landscape much earlier than the later monuments might have suggested. And that means researchers now have another place to look for evidence of how burial traditions developed, how families used tombs, how objects were selected, and how religious ideas changed over time. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the story is not what archaeologists found. It's what they almost didn't find. The tomb was hidden beneath another monument. The discovery happened while researchers were working on the superstructure of the much later tomb of Karabaskan. One excavation led to another. One layer of history was sitting directly on top of another. And that is ancient Egypt in a single image. The past wasn't erased. It was buried beneath more past. A Middle Kingdom family disappeared beneath later generations. Later tombs were built nearby. Floods changed the landscape. Centuries passed, and eventually archaeologists arrived with brushes, tools, cameras, recording equipment, and scientific methods. They began removing the layers, and the family emerged again. Not as a legend, not as a myth, but as human remains, jewelry, mirrors, coffin fragments, and the physical evidence of people who lived and died almost 4,000 years ago. We often imagine ancient Egypt through its greatest monuments, the pyramids, the temples, the golden masks, the pharaohs. But discoveries like this tell a different story. History was not created only by kings. It was created by families, by parents, by children, by craftsmen, by priests, by people whose names were never written into the history books. They lived ordinary lives inside an extraordinary civilization. And when they died, their families tried to make sure they would not simply disappear. They built a place for them. They placed objects beside them. They returned to that place. and eventually they sealed it. 4,000 years later, another group of people opened it, and for a brief moment those two worlds touched. The ancient family could not tell us who they were. They left no recorded explanation of their lives, but they left clues. 11 burials, jewelry, mirrors, amulets, coffins, and a tomb built into the landscape of ancient Thebes. Scientists will continue studying the remains and objects. They will compare the burial practices with other Middle Kingdom cemeteries. They will examine the materials. They will study the human remains, and they may eventually reconstruct parts of the family story that are still invisible today. But one mystery will remain. How many other tombs are still buried beneath the ground, waiting for someone to notice a small change in the soil? Because that is the strange lesson of this discovery. 4,000 years of history can disappear beneath your feet without leaving a sign, and sometimes all it takes to bring it back is one excavation, one unexpected layer, and one question. What is buried underneath this? And in ancient Egypt, that question can change everything.